They told me I'd never see kindness here. West Texas, September 1944. The sun pressed down on Camp Hearn, turning the red clay paths into ribbons of heat and shadow. The air shimmered like waves above the horizon, and the wind carried a faint scent of dry grass and horses. 8 women in gray uniforms stepped off the transport truck, their legs stiff from hours of sitting, ankles bound with iron shackles. Helga Muller adjusted the strap of her bag, her hands trembling, not from fatigue, but from the weight of uncertainty that settled over her like a thick, invisible blanket. The compound stretched before her, wooden barracks painted white, wire fences marking boundaries that seemed both confining and strangely orderly. In the distance, a ranch foreman walked along the corral, his boots kicking up dust. Captain John Thompson emerged from the shade of the administration building, his hat pulled low, eyes scanning the newcomers. Helga caught the glint of sunlight on the brim and held her breath. She had been told stories of brutality, of men who smiled as they commanded, men who punished without reason. This man, tall, broad-shouldered, with hands resting lightly on his belt, did not seem like the men of those stories. He did not shout. He did not gesture wildly. He simply watched, observing the line of women as if weighing each movement, each glance. The heat wrapped around her, sticky and relentless, making the metal shackles bite more than they had before. She shuffled forward, every step a careful negotiation between fear and necessity. Her companions followed, some whispering in German, some silent, faces pale beneath sweat-darkened hair. Thompson stepped closer, the gravel crunching under his boots, his gaze lingering on Helga for a moment longer than the others. He raised a hand, not in command, but in acknowledgement, a small gesture that made her pause. For a heartbeat, the air felt different, charged, as if it held a possibility she had long forgotten. The scent of baked bread from the mess hall drifted toward her, mingling with the dry dust, a reminder of life continuing despite everything. Helga's eyes flicked to a distant corral where a mare nuzzled her foal, the rhythmic stomping of hooves a grounding sound in the midst of uncertainty. Captain Thompson watched the interaction with quiet attention, noting her glance, the way her shoulders tensed then eased slightly. No words were exchanged, only the language of presence, of mutual acknowledgement across the gulf of circumstance. Helga adjusted the strap of her bag again, inhaled the sharp, dry air, and for the first time since crossing the Atlantic, allowed herself a moment to consider that perhaps, here, there could be something resembling fairness, perhaps even understanding. The sun climbed higher, casting stark lines across the compound, and with each measured step toward the barracks, Helga felt the tension in her body ebb just enough to let curiosity take hold, a whisper of awareness that not all those in authority sought to intimidate or harm. The dust settled behind them as the other women followed, their whispers fading, leaving only the rhythmic clatter of boots, the wind through the sparse trees, and the quiet, steady presence of a man whose glance suggested that perhaps, in the midst of rules and restrictions, a different kind of story could begin. The barracks were simple, whitewashed structures with windows open to catch the warm September breeze, the sun casting long shadows across the dirt courtyard where Helga Muller and the other women had been assigned their sleeping quarters. The air smelled faintly of hay from the nearby corral and the iron tang of the shackles that had been removed earlier, a reminder of journeys past, yet a hint of freedom threaded through every breath. Helga ran her fingers along the edge of the cot, feeling the scratch of the rough cotton sheets beneath her hands, noting how little comfort they provided, yet appreciating the cleanliness and order that contrasted sharply with the chaos she had endured in the previous months. Outside, the camp stirred to life with the measured rhythm of boots, the soft murmur of men checking fences and tending livestock, and the occasional clatter of a bucket or tool, sounds that were almost musical in their repetition and gave a sense of structure in a world that had felt entirely unmoored. Captain John Thompson appeared at the doorway of the administration building, scanning the courtyard once more, eyes catching the way the sunlight glinted off Helga's hair as she stood adjusting the strap of her bag. He did not approach immediately, but his presence was felt, a silent authority that did not demand obedience, only recognition. Helga, sensing the weight of that gaze, straightened her shoulders, inhaling the dry, warm air, and tried to imagine herself in this place for more than a few moments, not as a prisoner, but as someone who might find the possibility of trust. The day unfolded slowly, the women guided by the camp orderly to the mess hall for their first meal since arriving. The long tables, plain and functional, were lined with trays holding steaming eggs, slices of ham, buttered bread, and coffee, rich and dark. Helga hesitated at the edge of the line, eyes sweeping the room, noting the absence of guards at every table, the calm efficiency of the kitchen staff, and the way Captain Thompson stood near the doorway, observing without intruding, allowing them to take what was offered without ceremony. She reached for a slice of bread, feeling the warmth, noticing the soft texture and the way the butter melted almost immediately. The scent of cooked eggs mingled with coffee, creating an aroma that was unfamiliar and strangely comforting. She bit slowly, testing her surroundings with every chew, aware that every sound, every movement, might be a test of her perception, yet noting with a quiet astonishment that none of the feared cruelty appeared. The other women followed, some tentative, some silent, their hands moving with care, eyes flicking toward the commander, noting his measured demeanor, and the way he gave a small nod when one of the younger women seemed uncertain. After the meal, Helga found herself standing near the doorway, watching the camp unfold around her, the way men moved with purpose but without aggression, the way the sun shifted across the yard, casting patterns of light and shadow that made the ordinary seem extraordinary. Captain Thompson approached, walking slowly, boots crunching on the gravel, not in a hurry, not demanding attention, simply present. He stopped a few feet away, letting the silence speak before offering a single piece of advice, a quiet instruction about where to report for the day's duties, delivered in clear, measured tones, and Helga found herself listening, parsing every word, and feeling a small measure of relief at the simplicity of the exchange. Throughout the morning, she observed the rhythm of the camp, the chores assigned, the gentle insistence on order without harshness, and began to notice details that suggested care beneath the structure. Water provided for the women working under the hot sun, breaks allowed without question, a glance or a nod, that communicated concern without condescension. Captain Thompson continued his rounds, maintaining the same careful balance, stepping aside to allow them space, offering assistance only when it was evident that it was needed, a quiet choreography of guidance and respect that contrasted sharply with every expectation she had held before arrival. Helga felt herself relaxing incrementally, the tension in her shoulders easing, the knots in her stomach loosening as she recognized the possibility of safety in this place, not absolute, but enough to allow thought and observation. She began to notice Captain Thompson in fleeting moments of quiet humanity. The way he adjusted a young recruit's saddle with careful hands, the way he paused to listen to a complaint about a broken fence before giving measured instructions, the way he offered a small smile to one of the women who had struggled to carry a tray of food, not as mockery, but as acknowledgement. By midday, Helga moved among the barracks with more confidence, observing the routines, noting the small patterns of care and efficiency, allowing herself a cautious curiosity to grow, realizing that this camp, while structured and authoritative, was also a space where dignity was quietly preserved, and that the man whose eyes had first caught hers was a figure of authority who chose to exercise it with a measured hand, creating a rhythm in the day that invited trust, small moments of reassurance, and a sense of order that contrasted with the chaos of the world she had known. The afternoon sun hung low in the Texas sky, casting long, soft shadows across the red clay courtyard of Camp Hearn. Helga Muller moved with deliberate care, carrying a small bundle of linens to the barracks, her steps measured against the uneven ground. Each movement was observed, catalogued, processed within her mind, as if the rhythm of the camp itself demanded a careful respect. Captain John Thompson walked nearby, adjusting the brim of his hat to shield his eyes from the glare, scanning the women as they carried out their tasks with quiet precision. The distant sound of hooves striking the hard earth reached Helga's ears, blending with the soft creak of wooden gates and the low murmur of conversation in English, a language she understood partially, but enough to gauge tone and intent. A young woman ahead of her struggled with a bucket of water, the weight uneven, threatening to spill. Helga instinctively stepped closer, offering a steadying hand, and the girl gave a small nod of gratitude, eyes wide with relief. Thompson, noticing the interaction, allowed a faint smile to touch his lips before continuing along his route, his presence a quiet reassurance without intrusion. The barracks themselves smelled faintly of soap and straw, a simplicity that suggested routine and care rather than command and control. Helga set the linens down, arranging them neatly, noting the precise folds, the texture of the fabric against her palms, the way it seemed almost to absorb the warmth of the late afternoon sun streaming through the open windows. She paused, watching a breeze lift the edge of a curtain and carry the scent of distant mesquite and dry earth into the room, a reminder of the land beyond the camp boundaries and of life continuing outside these temporary walls. In that moment, the hum of activity in the yard became a background rhythm, allowing Helga to sense the subtle cadence of trust being established, not through words, but through observation and small, consistent gestures. Captain Thompson reappeared near the supply shed, where he carefully examined the stacks of barrels and crates, his eyes catching the smallest details, the alignment of tools, the placement of buckets, the way the younger women moved with practiced efficiency. He offered a nod, just barely perceptible, to Helga, acknowledging her diligence and the care with which she assisted others. The afternoon stretched on, punctuated by the soft clatter of tin cups in the mess hall, the occasional bird call, and the distant lowing of cattle, creating a tapestry of sensory cues that reminded Helga she was in a place where order and consideration were possible, even within the confines of structured oversight. As she returned to the courtyard after completing her tasks, her gaze met Thompson's for a fleeting second, and in that silent exchange, a mutual recognition passed between them, an understanding that the human spirit could exist within the boundaries of rules and schedules, that patience and observation were themselves acts of care. The sun dipped further, elongating shadows and bathing the camp in golden light, casting every detail in sharp relief. The dust rising from the dry earth, the shimmer of sweat on foreheads, the gentle sway of trees along the perimeter. Helga paused near the edge of the corral, inhaling the warmth and the faint aroma of feed, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease, replaced by a cautious curiosity about the world she was slowly beginning to understand. Thompson remained nearby, vigilant but unobtrusive, his posture relaxed, yet his presence commanding attention. Each movement he made was deliberate, measured, reinforcing the quiet order of the camp, while leaving space for autonomy and observation. Helga allowed herself a small, unspoken exhalation, acknowledging the rhythm of this place, the delicate balance of authority and respect, and the subtle bond forming through shared presence and silent understanding. The day in Camp Hearn carried forward, ordinary in its routines yet extraordinary in the minute acts of recognition and care that threaded through every interaction, leaving Helga with a sense of grounding, a feeling that, amid uncertainty and unfamiliar surroundings, there existed a possibility of trust and quiet connection. The late afternoon sun had begun to soften, casting a warm, golden hue across the sprawling grounds of Camp Hearn, and the dust that had settled over the courtyard during the heat of the day shimmered faintly in the gentle light. Helga Muller walked slowly toward the central garden area, a small patch of earth bordered by weathered wooden planks, where herbs and vegetables had been planted earlier in the season. Each step was careful, her feet brushing against the uneven clay and small stones, and she noted the scent of tilled soil mixed with the faint aroma of dried mesquite from nearby trees. Captain John Thompson moved with quiet deliberation nearby, overseeing the afternoon assignments of the other women without intruding on Helga's movements. He adjusted the strap of his canvas satchel over his shoulder and paused to watch her, noting the subtle way she paused to inspect a sprouting leaf, the tilt of her head, the concentration in her eyes, and the gentle way she placed her hands against the soil before adjusting her footing. The rhythm of the camp had settled into a gentle cadence, punctuated by the distant calls of farm animals, the soft clatter of buckets, and the occasional muted laughter from the mess hall, where a group of women cleaned and organized trays. Helga knelt beside the soil, brushing her fingers along the moist earth, feeling the texture and warmth beneath her palms, and she allowed herself a quiet exhale, the tension in her shoulders releasing just enough for her to notice. The small details around her, the precise alignment of garden rows, the faint hum of insects, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves and cast shifting shadows across her hands. Thompson continued his rounds, walking slowly along the garden's perimeter, his eyes catching the movements of each woman, the way they approached their tasks with measured care, and the subtle ways they interacted without words, creating a tapestry of silent communication that suggested trust was slowly being established. Helga noticed the careful attention in his gaze, the way he did not interfere, only observed, and she felt a cautious reassurance growing within her, an understanding that he was present not as an enforcer, but as a silent guide, allowing autonomy while ensuring safety. She adjusted her apron and bent to tend to a cluster of young tomato plants, the green stems brushing against her fingers as she checked for damage or dryness, and the faint scent of earth and ripening fruit mingled with the lingering warmth of the afternoon sun. Nearby, Thompson stopped to inspect a row of squash plants, kneeling briefly to examine the leaves and soil, and Helga could see the faint crease of concentration on his forehead, the careful movements of his hands as he gently adjusted a leaning stem. The quiet interaction, separated by a few feet but linked by shared observation and a mutual awareness of each other's presence, created a rhythm that filled the space with subtle but powerful connection. As the light shifted toward the horizon, casting longer shadows and softening the colors of the buildings and earth, Helga straightened and took a step back, brushing her hands lightly against her apron, and she noticed Thompson's gaze meeting hers once again, steady and unspoken, acknowledging her care and diligence. She felt the faintest flutter of confidence, the first sense that within this structured environment, a shared understanding and respect could emerge, and that her observations and actions mattered in ways beyond the immediate tasks. The afternoon air carried a coolness that hinted at evening, and the faint scent of coffee from the mess hall drifted across the courtyard, mingling with the dust and the earthy aroma of the garden. Helga inhaled deeply, letting the mixture of smells and warmth anchor her, and she allowed her eyes to roam across the camp, noticing the order, the subtle gestures of care among the women, and the presence of Thompson, whose silent attention communicated steadiness, reliability, and an unspoken invitation to trust. The golden light continued to bathe the camp, emphasizing textures, angles, and the interplay of shadow and illumination, giving each small motion weight and significance, and Helga found herself moving with more certainty, more awareness, and a quiet appreciation for the subtle harmony that was forming through simple observation, attentive care, and the gentle rhythm of shared, unspoken understanding. The sun had dipped lower behind the distant hills, casting long, soft shadows that stretched across the dusty paths of Camp Hearn, and the warmth of the late afternoon lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of hay, dry earth, and the subtle aroma of cooking from the mess hall. Helga Muller carried a small watering can through the garden, her hands brushing against the young tomato plants, feeling the delicate tension of the stems and the dampness of the soil beneath her fingers. Each step was careful, measured, attuned to the rhythm of the camp, and she noted the way sunlight shifted across the courtyard, painting patterns that moved slowly as the day edged toward evening. Captain John Thompson approached from the far end of the garden, his boots stirring dust and small pebbles, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his face. Yet his eyes caught the light, reflecting a quiet attentiveness. Helga paused, glancing up, feeling the weight of his gaze, not heavy with authority, but observant, noting her movements, her attention to the plants, and the subtle care with which she tended the earth. She allowed herself a small exhale, noticing the gentle breeze that stirred her hair, carrying with it the sound of distant cattle and the muted clatter of tools from the farm. The garden had become a space of quiet focus, a refuge within the larger structure of the camp, and Helga found herself moving with a sense of purpose that had not been possible in the chaotic months before her arrival. Thompson stood a few feet away, adjusting a wooden crate, his movements deliberate, controlled, a calm presence that did not demand attention, yet drew it naturally. Helga felt a cautious reassurance, the kind that comes from observing consistency and careful attention, the sense that in this space, actions had meaning and gestures of care were noticed. She placed the watering can down, brushing her hands against the fabric of her apron, and took a moment to observe the other women in the garden, their quiet cooperation, the subtle ways they assisted each other without words, a silent communication formed through shared labor and mutual attentiveness. Thompson moved closer, speaking softly as he provided instructions for the next tasks, his voice measured, carrying over the gentle hum of activity, guiding without imposing, suggesting without directing, and Helga listened, parsing every word, every inflection, noting the patience and thought behind each sentence. The sun continued its descent, bathing the compound in a golden glow, elongating shadows and emphasizing the textures of earth, wood, and cloth. Helga found herself pausing to watch the way light played across Thompson's features, the careful angles, the subtle expressions that conveyed thoughtfulness and awareness. She tended a small row of herbs, fingers brushing gently over the leaves, feeling the fine hairs and veins, noticing the slight movement of a breeze that lifted the scent toward her and allowed a moment of quiet reflection to enter her mind. Around them, the camp carried on in steady rhythm. The distant shuffle of boots, the muted voices of women as they carried trays of water, the soft clatter of tools against wooden surfaces, and the occasional call from one end of the yard to another, all blending into a gentle cadence of routine and order. Helga straightened, inhaling the warm air, and felt a subtle connection to the space, to the routines, to the unspoken understanding that existed between the women and between her and Thompson. The afternoon light softened further, the horizon deepening into warm amber and muted rose, casting long, slow shadows that mirrored the quiet patience of the camp. Thompson walked past her, acknowledging her attention to detail with a brief, almost imperceptible nod, and Helga felt a quiet satisfaction, a recognition that her efforts were seen and appreciated without ceremony, a small measure of trust beginning to form. She adjusted her apron once more, stepped back to take in the scene, noticing the patterns of movement, the subtle gestures of care, and the rhythm of work unfolding naturally, and allowed herself a sense of cautious optimism, that within the structure and discipline of the camp, moments of understanding, observation, and silent communication could create a space of human connection and dignity. The light continued to fade, stretching the shadows across the compound, and Helga stood still for a moment, taking in the warmth on her skin, the sounds of activity, the gentle guidance of Thompson nearby, and the quiet, unfolding rhythm of life within the camp that had begun to feel more like a space of measured trust than simple confinement. The sun had settled near the horizon, painting the West Texas sky with streaks of amber and soft pink, casting long, shifting shadows across the open spaces of Camp Hearn. Helga Muller carried a small basket of freshly gathered vegetables from the garden to the mess hall, each step measured, mindful of the uneven clay beneath her feet. The women around her moved in quiet coordination, a rhythm emerging from shared tasks and unspoken communication, their laughter muted but genuine, as they exchanged small smiles and nods of acknowledgement. Captain John Thompson walked along the edge of the courtyard, hands clasped behind his back, observing the flow of activity with an attentive calm, noticing the way Helga paused occasionally to inspect a ripe tomato, the gentle care she took in selecting each one, and the subtle ease with which she offered a helping hand to a younger woman balancing a tray. The wind carried the faint scent of baked bread and simmering vegetables, mingling with the dry heat and the earthy aroma of the tilled garden soil, creating a sensory tapestry that felt alive with subtle reassurance. Helga approached the mess hall doors, brushing her hands lightly against her apron, and felt the weight of her new surroundings pressing in gently yet without menace, the quiet order and routine allowing her to breathe with a measure of relief she had not known in months. Thompson paused near a barrel used for water, his gaze tracking the movements of the women as they filed past, noting small details, the careful folding of aprons, the way hands met the soil and tools with purpose, the faint expressions of concentration and quiet satisfaction as each task was completed. Helga entered the hall and arranged the vegetables along the serving table, feeling the smooth weight of squash and the firmness of tomatoes beneath her fingers, noting the subtle differences in texture, color, and scent, allowing herself to take pleasure in the small, ordinary beauty of the task. Outside, The fading sunlight glimmered across the barbed wire perimeter and the tops of the wooden barracks, highlighting the contrast between structure and freedom, constraint and care, and Helga felt the first stirrings of understanding that the human spirit could thrive even within the parameters of routine and oversight. Thompson moved closer to the edge of the hall, observing Helga without interruption, allowing her space while offering a presence that was steady and unobtrusive, his careful attention conveying a silent reassurance, an acknowledgement of her diligence, and the respect he had for her efforts. The distant lowing of cattle, the soft clatter of trays, and the occasional murmur of conversation created a background rhythm that underscored the quiet energy of the afternoon, blending the practical with the serene, the ordinary with moments of subtle connection. Helga carried the basket back toward the courtyard, moving with a sense of awareness heightened by observation and the gentle reinforcement of trust growing through these small interactions. She noticed Thompson pausing to speak softly with a staff member, gesturing with hands that conveyed calm authority, and she felt the faintest sense of security, the recognition that order and kindness could coexist in the same space, shaping the daily experience of everyone within it. The sun dipped lower, elongating shadows and softening colors, bathing the camp in golden light that accentuated the textures of the earth, wood, and fabric, and Helga allowed herself a quiet moment to reflect on the subtle lessons of observation, care, and patience she had absorbed. Each breath of warm, dry air, each glance exchanged without words, each gesture of attention from Thompson contributed to a growing sense of connection, the rhythm of routine transforming into a framework where trust and understanding could quietly take root. As evening approached, Helga paused near the garden, inhaling deeply the mingling scents of soil, herbs, and distant mesquite, feeling the tension in her body ease further, replaced by a gentle, cautious curiosity about what each new day might bring within this structured, observant, and quietly supportive environment, and she realized that in the shared spaces of the camp, the rhythm of daily life, attentive presence, and consistent care could create a subtle but profound sense of human connection. The sky shifted toward a deeper orange as the sun sank behind the distant hills, stretching the shadows across Camp Hearn and softening the harsh lines of the barracks and fences. Helga Muller carried a small tin of water toward the garden, her movements deliberate, careful not to spill a single drop, aware of the rhythm of the day and the delicate balance between work and observation. The air was warm, dry, carrying the faint scents of earth, herbs, and the lingering aroma of the midday meal, a mix that grounded her in the present moment. Captain John Thompson walked along the edge of the courtyard, boots stirring dust and small stones, hands resting lightly on the brim of his hat as he observed the women completing their assignments. He paused near a row of raised beds, noting the subtle movements of Helga as she knelt to water the plants, the careful attention in her hands, the slight tilt of her head as she assessed each stem, each leaf, each small cluster of green. The women moved with quiet efficiency, a rhythm emerging from shared labor and unspoken understanding, laughter muted but genuine, the occasional glance exchanged, and Helga felt the first faint stirrings of ease, the sense that within these structured routines, connection could be found. Thompson approached the central path, his steps measured, not intrusive, his presence reassuring in its calm authority. He watched Helga step back from the tomato plants to adjust the water can, noting the careful way she brushed soil from her hands and the subtle shift of expression as she noticed a young sprout leaning precariously. Without speaking, he gestured slightly toward the nearest stake, a silent suggestion, and Helga understood immediately, moving to secure the plant with gentle precision. The interaction passed in quiet acknowledgement, their shared focus and attention forming a bridge that did not require words. The courtyard was filled with the soft clatter of tools, the shuffle of boots on dry clay, the occasional call of a distant bird, all woven together into a rhythm that gave shape to the camp and a subtle sense of order to those within it. Helga paused to observe the other women tending their tasks, noting the careful alignment of watering cans, the folding of aprons, the measured steps taken across uneven ground, and she felt the gentle reassurance of familiarity and routine settling into her chest. Thompson moved along the edge of the barracks, glancing briefly at each workstation, offering the occasional nod or silent acknowledgement, gestures that communicated recognition without intrusion, reinforcing the quiet dignity of labor performed well. Helga adjusted the strap of her apron, took a small inhalation of the warm air, and noticed the way the sunlight cast long, moving shadows over the soil and wooden planks, the interplay of light and movement creating patterns that drew her attention and invited careful consideration of each detail. She knelt once more by the herb patch, fingers brushing the leaves, noting the subtle variations in color and texture, the delicate resilience of each plant, and she allowed a faint sense of satisfaction to grow quietly within her. Thompson paused nearby, observing her attentiveness, a faint crease of concentration on his forehead as he watched her hands move with purpose and care, and Helga caught the slight tilt of his head, the silent approval in the way he lingered just long enough to note her diligence. The warmth of the late afternoon continued to soften the harsh edges of the camp, casting everything in golden tones, and Helga felt the tension in her shoulders ease further, replaced by a quiet awareness of space, rhythm, and the unspoken trust growing between her and the man who moved with measured presence alongside the routines of the day. The distant sounds of the mess hall, the soft murmurs of the other women, and the occasional clink of tools provided a gentle backdrop, a steady cadence that allowed Helga to feel anchored, to observe the subtle interactions and gestures that threaded through the camp, and to recognize that even in this structured environment, care, patience, and observation could form the basis of connection, confidence, and an emerging sense of belonging. As the light continued to fade toward evening, Helga stood for a moment, inhaling the cool hints of breeze, the faint aroma of soil and herbs, feeling a calm awareness settle over her, and she noted the quiet presence of Thompson nearby, a steady figure of guidance and reassurance, whose careful attention and subtle gestures had begun to transform the rhythms of the day into a framework of trust, understanding, and quiet human connection. The sky had deepened into a soft gradient of violet and amber as the sun slipped further toward the horizon, and the long shadows of the wooden barracks stretched across the courtyard of Camp Hearn, their shapes shifting slowly with the fading light. Helga Muller moved deliberately along the narrow paths between the garden beds, a small watering can in one hand, the gentle rustle of her dress against her legs mixing with the faint creak of a gate swinging in the breeze. The air was warm but carried a hint of cooling evening, the dry scent of earth and mesquite drifting upward, mingling with the lingering aroma of cooked vegetables and coffee from the mess hall. Captain John Thompson walked near the corral, his eyes scanning the camp with a quiet attentiveness, noting the subtle interactions among the women, the careful way they carried tools and baskets, the occasional exchange of smiles or nods, all forming a silent language of cooperation. Helga paused beside a row of herbs, brushing the soil lightly with her fingertips and feeling the texture of leaves beneath her palms, noting the delicate curl of a mint stem and the firmness of basil, the richness of their green against the soft, fading light. Thompson approached slowly, his boots stirring the dust. His presence felt more than heard, and Helga glanced up, meeting his gaze for a fleeting second, a moment suspended in quiet understanding. The women moved in measured steps through the courtyard, the sound of water in tin cans and soft shuffling on dry clay forming a rhythmic backdrop that made the ordinary feel deliberate, intentional, a choreography of attention and care. Helga set the watering can down and observed a younger woman struggling slightly with a basket of squash, stepping forward to offer assistance, her hands guiding the weight with gentle precision, and the girl gave a small, grateful nod before continuing. Thompson watched this interaction with calm attentiveness, his eyes tracing the lines of movement, the subtle shifts in posture, the quiet acknowledgement that passed between the two women, and he allowed himself the faintest curve of a smile before continuing his walk, letting the observation pass without interruption. The sunlight dimmed, casting warmer tones across the wooden surfaces, highlighting textures of the barracks, the fences, and the garden tools, emphasizing detail in ways that made each gesture more meaningful. Helga adjusted her apron, inhaling the warm, dry air, and felt the faint pressure in her chest ease, replaced by a quiet awareness of her surroundings, the rhythm of the camp, and the attentiveness that surrounded her. fostering a sense of calm and measured curiosity. Thompson paused near the edge of the garden, observing the interplay of light and movement, noting the care in Helga's hands as she brushed soil and inspected plants, and the way her gaze lifted occasionally to meet his before moving back to her tasks. A silent conversation carried in glances and shared attention. The courtyard filled with subtle sounds, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft tapping of boots on gravel, the occasional murmur of conversation, blending into a gentle cadence that reinforced the order of the camp, the consistency of routine, and the quiet assurance that care and attentiveness were recognized. Helga walked along the rows, noting the gentle sway of leaves in the evening breeze, the shifting light playing across surfaces and shadows, and she allowed herself to notice small details that had previously escaped her. The angle of sunlight through the window panes, the way dust motes floated like tiny lanterns, the faint warmth of a brick touched briefly by the sun. Thompson stepped closer, his gaze sweeping the courtyard with deliberate patience, offering an unspoken reassurance through presence alone, and Helga felt a subtle sense of connection, the understanding that even in structured, orderly routines, gestures of attentiveness, quiet observation, and consistency could form the foundations of trust and human connection. The colors deepened, the sounds softened, and Helga paused to take in the scene, inhaling the cooling air, sensing the rhythm of work winding down, and noticing the gentle but firm presence of Thompson nearby, a figure whose quiet attention and measured actions continued to shape the environment into a space of calm, respect, and subtle, growing familiarity. The evening settled over Camp Hearn with a gentle hush, the sky painted in fading shades of amber and soft purple, casting the barracks and courtyard in long, stretched shadows that moved slowly with the descent of the sun. Helga Muller carried a small bundle of freshly harvested herbs from the garden to the mess hall, her steps careful and deliberate over the uneven red clay paths, mindful of the rhythm of the camp and the patterns of light and shadow around her. Each step brought the faint sound of her boots pressing into dust, mixing with the soft shuffle of others moving about their chores and the occasional murmur of conversation, creating a steady cadence that spoke of routine, focus, and the quiet hum of shared effort. Captain John Thompson walked along the perimeter, adjusting the strap of his canvas satchel over one shoulder, eyes scanning the courtyard. With calm attentiveness, noting the way each woman carried her work, the precision of movement, and the subtle exchanges of assistance and encouragement passing silently between them. Helga paused by a row of tomato plants, brushing soil from her hands and feeling the warmth of the earth, the firmness of the green stems beneath her fingers, and the delicate curl of each leaf, absorbing the textures, the scent, and the gentle movement of a breeze that stirred them. Thompson stepped closer, maintaining a respectful distance, his presence steady yet unobtrusive, offering the reassurance of consistent observation without interference. Helga glanced up briefly to meet his eyes, catching the faintest nod of acknowledgement, a silent confirmation that her care and attention were seen and noted. She continued along the garden beds, adjusting the bundles of herbs in her hands, noting the subtle variations in color, the soft sheen of leaves, the way light shifted across the soil and plants with the setting sun, casting a gentle glow that made each detail appear more vivid. The women moved around her in a coordinated rhythm, carrying water, tools, and baskets, their quiet cooperation forming a tapestry of small gestures and attentive movements that made the courtyard feel alive with purpose and care. Thompson paused near the corner of the barracks, observing the subtle interactions, noting the way Helga's posture relaxed slightly as she assisted a younger woman with a tray of vegetables, the small smiles exchanged, the careful consideration evident in every movement. The fading light caught the edges of the wooden structures, the tops of fences, and the soft curves of plants, highlighting textures and casting everything in a warm, almost golden hue that emphasized quiet detail and the gentle order emerging in the camp. Helga adjusted her apron, inhaling deeply the mixed scents of earth, herbs, and the residual warmth of the sun on the clay paths, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease as she took in the careful choreography of the day's work, the attentive presence of Thompson nearby, and the unspoken acknowledgement of effort and diligence that flowed through every small gesture. The distant lowing of cattle, the muted clatter of tools, and the soft rustle of leaves in the gentle evening breeze provided a backdrop that grounded her, allowing her to notice subtle movements. The sway of a plant, the gentle alignment of trays, the careful folding of fabric, and to absorb the lessons in observation, patience, and quiet connection being woven through the routines of the camp. Thompson walked past the edge of the garden, pausing to straighten a leaning tomato stake and noting the way Helga adjusted a bundle in her hands with careful precision, and she caught his brief glance, a moment of shared awareness, silent communication, and the recognition that the small, deliberate actions of the day were meaningful and noticed. The sky deepened further, shadows stretching long across the courtyard, the warmth giving way to a coolness in the air, carrying faint hints of mesquite and soil, and Helga stood for a moment, allowing herself to feel a subtle sense of connection, an awareness that in the rhythm of work, shared presence, and careful observation, trust and understanding could quietly flourish. As she took a step back to survey the garden and the courtyard beyond, she noticed the delicate interplay of light and shadow, the consistent attention of Thompson, and the way every measured gesture contributed to a growing sense of human connection, calm, and quiet dignity within the structured space of the camp. The night had begun to settle over Camp Hearn, the sky a deep indigo with scattered stars appearing faintly above the distant hills, casting a serene, almost hushed light over the barracks, garden, and courtyard. Helga Muller carried a small basket of freshly gathered vegetables toward the mess hall, the red clay paths cool beneath her boots, the air carrying a gentle chill that contrasted with the lingering warmth of the day. Each step was measured, deliberate, mindful of the uneven ground, and she noticed the faint crunch of gravel beneath her feet, blending with the distant low murmur of other women finishing their tasks and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Captain John Thompson moved along the edge of the courtyard, hands resting lightly on his belt, observing the women as they carried out their final chores, his presence calm, deliberate, and reassuring. He paused near a water barrel, noting the subtle way Helga adjusted the contents of her basket, the careful way she balanced the vegetables, and the small attention she gave to a younger woman nearby who stumbled slightly with her tray. The sounds of the camp at night were gentle but steady, the soft clatter of utensils, the rustling of aprons, the distant lowing of cattle settling in for the evening, and the muted murmur of conversation, all blending into a comforting rhythm that filled the courtyard with a sense of quiet purpose. Helga paused by a row of herbs, brushing soil from her hands and inhaling the faintly sweet, earthy scent, noticing the way the evening light cast long, delicate shadows across the wooden planks and clay paths, highlighting the textures and shapes of the camp in a soft, almost cinematic glow. Thompson approached slowly, walking along the edge of the garden with quiet assurance, noting the meticulous care Helga took in arranging the vegetables and observing the subtle communication among the women as they completed their tasks. The breeze lifted a few stray leaves, carrying their scent and the faint warmth of the day into the cool night air, and Helga allowed herself a small exhale, a quiet acknowledgement of the rhythm and balance that had begun to take hold within the camp. The women moved with gentle coordination, exchanging nods and small smiles, their shared tasks forming a silent understanding of cooperation, trust, and attentiveness. Thompson observed without intruding, his presence steady, a figure of quiet authority and assurance, allowing the women to complete their work while providing subtle guidance through observation and minimal intervention. Helga glanced up briefly as he passed, catching his gaze and noting the subtle acknowledgement in his expression, a recognition of diligence and care that passed without words. The courtyard reflected the interplay of fading light and long shadows, creating shifting patterns across the garden beds, barracks, and pathways, emphasizing the attention to detail in every small movement, gesture, and task. Helga adjusted her apron, inhaled the crisp evening air, and felt the tension of the day ease further, replaced by a calm awareness of her surroundings, the rhythm of work, and the attentiveness of those around her. Thompson paused near a wooden fence, watching a small group of women finish watering the plants, noting the care, precision, and subtle cooperation in each movement, and Helga noticed the faint relaxation in his posture, the unspoken reassurance that they were all seen and acknowledged. The evening carried a soft serenity, the gentle interplay of light, shadow, scent, and sound providing a backdrop that allowed for quiet observation and subtle connection. Helga moved to set the basket down near the mess hall steps, brushing soil from her hands one last time and noting the interplay of fading sunlight and shadow across the courtyard, the soft murmurs and movements of the women, and the calm, attentive presence of Thompson nearby. The night deepened, the air cool against her skin, and Helga allowed herself to notice the rhythms and patterns that had taken shape, the quiet trust forming through attention, care, and consistent presence, a sense of connection weaving between her and the man whose steady observation and measured guidance had transformed the environment into a space of quiet dignity, order, and subtle human understanding. She stood for a moment, inhaling the mingled scents of soil, herbs, and the faint lingering warmth of the day, feeling a calm assurance that within the structure, routine, and shared presence of Camp Hearn, moments of trust, observation, and subtle connection could quietly flourish, anchoring her to the rhythm and gentle order of the evening. The first stars appeared in the deepening Texas sky, small pinpricks of light that twinkled faintly above the hills surrounding Camp Hearn, casting a serene, almost meditative atmosphere across the barracks and open courtyards. Helga Muller walked slowly toward the central garden one last time for the day, her boots pressing softly into the cool clay paths, the basket of herbs in her hands swaying slightly with each careful step. The air was cooler now, carrying a faint scent of earth, dried mesquite, and the lingering warmth of the afternoon sun that still kissed the tops of the wooden structures and garden beds. She paused beside the tomato plants, running her fingers lightly over the leaves and stems, noting the subtle movement of a breeze that lifted the aroma of fresh soil and greenery into the air. Captain John Thompson moved along the edge of the courtyard, boots stirring small clouds of dust, hands clasped loosely behind his back, his eyes attentive yet unintrusive as he observed the rhythm of the camp. He noticed the way Helga bent carefully over each plant, the deliberation in her movements, the way she offered gentle guidance to a younger woman adjusting a stake in a row of squash, and he allowed a faint nod of acknowledgement to pass, subtle and unspoken. The women moved with quiet coordination through the courtyard, carrying water, tools, and small bundles, their gestures forming a soft choreography of cooperation and attentiveness that created an atmosphere of calm purpose. Helga paused to inhale the faintly sweet and earthy scents rising from the garden soil, letting her eyes take in the shifting shadows cast by the long, fading light. She noticed the subtle patterns of movement among the women, the way tasks were completed with careful precision, and the way Thompson's presence, steady and observant, gave shape to the routine without demanding attention or control. The sound of distant cattle settling for the evening, the soft clatter of tin watering cans, and the low murmur of voices provided a gentle cadence that underscored the structured calm of the camp. Helga moved to set her basket down near the edge of the garden, adjusting her apron and brushing soil from her hands, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease as she absorbed the quiet rhythm and gentle order of the evening. Thompson walked past, pausing to straighten a leaning plant stake, observing the careful work of Helga and the subtle interactions between her and the other women, noting the unspoken communication carried in glances, gestures, and shared attention. The light continued to fade, elongating shadows across the garden beds, paths, and barracks, highlighting textures in the wooden fences, soil, and leaves, and bringing a soft, golden glow that made each detail more vivid. Helga inhaled the crisp evening air, noticing the interplay of scents, sounds, and light, and allowed herself to feel a small, quiet sense of trust growing, a recognition that careful observation, consistent attention, and thoughtful presence could create a space of subtle connection and reassurance. Thompson paused near the edge of the garden once more, glancing at the lines of plants, the movement of the women, and the gentle attentiveness of Helga, his posture relaxed yet deliberate, a presence that grounded the space without imposing. Helga adjusted the basket of herbs in her hands, taking a measured step back to observe the courtyard and the rhythms unfolding across it, the subtle gestures of care and cooperation, and the steady, quiet influence of Thompson's attentive observation. The evening air carried a gentle coolness, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant sounds of settling animals, and the soft murmurs of work completed blending into a soothing cadence that allowed Helga to notice the harmony of small actions, the trust being quietly formed, and the shared rhythm of a day ending within the calm, attentive space of Camp Hearn. She paused briefly, inhaling the cool, earthy air and allowing the quiet presence of Thompson nearby to anchor her senses, feeling the gentle reassurance of consistent attention and subtle acknowledgement, the knowledge that even within structure and routine, human connection could take root, small but meaningful, carrying the promise of trust, understanding, and quiet dignity into the coming days. The last light of day faded behind the distant hills, leaving a soft, cooling darkness over Camp Hearn, the sky deep indigo with stars beginning to punctuate the evening with quiet brilliance. Helga Muller walked slowly along the clay paths, the basket of herbs balanced in her hands, feeling the coolness of the earth beneath her boots and the gentle brush of a faint breeze against her skin. The air carried the subtle sense of soil, dried mesquite, and the lingering warmth of the day, blending into a fragrance that was earthy, calming, and grounding. Captain John Thompson moved along the edge of the courtyard, his posture relaxed but attentive, eyes sweeping the camp with quiet precision, noting the final movements of the women as they completed their evening tasks, the subtle exchanges of assistance, the careful folding of aprons, and the measured handling of tools and baskets. Helga paused at the edge of the garden, brushing soil lightly from her hands and feeling the texture of leaves and stems beneath her fingertips, noting the way each plant leaned slightly with the evening breeze and how shadows stretched across the earth, elongating every detail in soft, muted light. Thompson stepped closer, maintaining a distance that allowed observation without intrusion, his gaze tracing her movements with quiet attention, noticing the careful way she handled the herbs, the subtle grace in her posture, and the way she offered a gentle hand to a younger woman adjusting a small steak in a row of vegetables. The sounds of the camp at night were gentle and deliberate, the soft shuffle of boots on clay, the distant lowing of cattle settling in the corral, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the faint murmur of voices, forming a cadence that lent the courtyard a calm, rhythmic order. Helga inhaled deeply, allowing the scents and sounds to settle around her, feeling the tension of the day release from her shoulders, replaced by a quiet awareness of space, order, and the subtle presence of Thompson nearby. She adjusted her apron, straightened slightly, and let her eyes take in the courtyard, the barracks, the raised beds, and the lines of women moving with precise coordination, each action contributing to the overall rhythm and sense of purpose within the camp. Thompson moved quietly along the perimeter, pausing to check a wooden stake, the tilt of his head and the measured focus in his eyes a silent reassurance that diligence, care, and attentiveness were recognized and valued. Helga observed him as he worked, noting the deliberate calm in his movements, the way he balanced presence and attention without demanding acknowledgement, and she felt a sense of trust grow, subtle but steady, within the quiet, structured environment. The night deepened, the air cooling further, the sky darkening to a rich indigo dotted with faint stars, and Helga continued to move through the courtyard, her footsteps soft, her attention keen, absorbing the faint sounds of distant chores completed and the quiet interactions that threaded through the camp like a gentle current. Thompson paused briefly near the edge of the garden, glancing at Helga with a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the care and thoughtfulness in her movements, and Helga allowed herself a small, inward smile, recognizing the shared understanding carried in such quiet, unspoken gestures. The courtyard was bathed in a soft, even darkness, lit faintly by moonlight and reflected stars, and the subtle interplay of shadow and light highlighted textures, the roughness of the clay paths, the smoothness of leaves, the worn wood of the garden stakes, the folds of aprons, and the careful arrangement of baskets and tools. Helga paused again, inhaling the cool night air, taking in the gentle rhythm of the camp, the attentive presence of Thompson, and the subtle, almost imperceptible connections forming through shared observation, careful action, and quiet acknowledgement. The distant sounds of settling animals, soft murmurs, and shifting leaves blended into a soothing cadence that reinforced the sense of calm and order, and Helga felt herself grounded, connected, and attuned to the subtle web of trust, attentiveness, and human presence that stretched across the courtyard, weaving each action, glance, and small gesture into a tapestry of quiet understanding and dignity within the structured environment of Camp Hearn. As she set the basket down gently near the garden gate, Helga allowed a final exhale, taking in the night air, the fading warmth, the steady presence of Thompson nearby, and the subtle, steady rhythm of life within the camp that carried the promise of patience, observation, and trust into the days ahead. The sky had deepened into a rich midnight blue, the stars bright above the hills surrounding Camp Hearn, casting faint silver light across the barracks, garden, and courtyard. Helga Muller walked slowly through the quiet paths of the camp, the basket of herbs in her hands swinging gently with each careful step, the cool air brushing against her skin and carrying the earthy scent of soil, mesquite, and the lingering warmth of the day. Each step pressed softly into the clay, the sound muted and deliberate, blending with the gentle shuffle of distant feet, the occasional murmur of conversation, and the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Captain John Thompson moved along the edge of the garden, his boots pressing lightly against the earth, his posture relaxed yet attentive, eyes scanning the courtyard with measured precision, noting the subtle movements and gestures of the women completing their final tasks. Helga paused beside a row of tomato plants, brushing soil gently from her fingers, observing the delicate curl of leaves and the firmness of stems, feeling the coolness of the evening air and the faint warmth retained in the soil beneath her palms. Thompson approached at a deliberate pace, careful not to startle her, noting the concentration in her movements, the way she offered a quiet hand to a younger woman balancing a small tray, and the faint acknowledgement in her glance as their eyes met briefly, a silent recognition of effort, attention, and the growing trust that threaded between them. The courtyard was filled with subtle nocturnal sounds, the low murmur of activity fading, the gentle clatter of equipment, the distant lowing of cattle, and the whisper of wind through sparse trees, all blending into a steady, calming cadence. Helga placed the basket down at the edge of the garden, adjusting her apron and brushing off loose soil, her posture easing as she allowed herself to absorb the gentle rhythm and quiet order of the camp. Thompson paused nearby, observing without intrusion, noting the attentiveness in her hands, the small gestures of care she offered, and the quiet cooperation among the women, understanding how subtle guidance, patient observation, and consistent attention had cultivated a sense of calm, trust, and mutual respect throughout the day. Helga inhaled deeply, noticing the interplay of light and shadow cast by moonlight, the gentle movements of leaves and branches, the muted textures of wooden barracks and garden beds, and felt a quiet acknowledgement of the connection being formed, unspoken yet profoundly present, between her and the man whose steady observation had shaped the day into one of measured care and attentive presence. The cool night air carried the scent of herbs, soil, and lingering warmth, mingling with the faint sounds of the camp settling for the night, creating an atmosphere of stillness and reflection. Helga walked along the paths, noting the soft patterns of activity, the careful folding of aprons, the measured handling of tools and baskets, and the subtle glances exchanged between women, all contributing to a rhythm that spoke of mutual respect and gentle understanding. Thompson stepped closer, observing the way Helga paused at a small garden gate, adjusting the contents of her basket with meticulous care, offering silent reassurance through the calmness of his posture and the attentiveness in his gaze. The night deepened further, shadows stretching long across the courtyard, barracks, and garden beds, and Helga allowed herself to feel the faintest sense of comfort, the knowledge that patience, observation, and careful attention could create a framework of trust and understanding within the structured environment of the camp. The soft, steady cadence of settling animals, distant murmurs, and rustling leaves underscored the quiet dignity of work completed and presence maintained, and Helga stood for a moment, inhaling the cool, earthy air and letting the subtle reassurance of Thompson's presence anchor her awareness. The courtyard glimmered faintly under moonlight, highlighting textures of soil, plants, and wooden surfaces, while the careful gestures of attention and observation threaded through every motion, creating an almost imperceptible but profound sense of connection. Helga exhaled slowly, her mind reflecting on the day, the trust that had grown quietly, the small yet meaningful interactions, and the knowledge that even within structure and routine, patience, attentiveness, and gentle presence could form the foundation of human understanding, respect, and quiet, enduring connection across the space of Camp Hearn, carrying promise into all the days that would follow.